We want you to think about these questions and talk about these questions, and we will come back together and report out kind of what the discussion looked like, and really want you to be able to just speak to us about the key points that you cover when you have this discussion with your small group. So really, what do you still want to know about the drivers of the racial wealth gap? We've talked about issues of higher education, home ownership, income, and Tom spoke to inheritance. What about that do you want to know more about? We've had a number of speakers talk about the importance of stories and narratives. So in your group, think about what kinds of narratives do we need to tell to move this work forward, just given what you heard over the last couple of days. And finally, what opportunities exist to move this work forward? I have been in conversations with people about how we can work together just in this summit alone. And I know others had conversations about partnering and outlining what kind of opportunities may exist to think about working on the issue of the racial wealth gap.
All right, what do we still want to know about the drivers of the racial wealth gap? At the risk of, I'm going to try to make this not all about what I was thinking and make sure, incorporate the ideas from everybody in our group. But starting off with, I would like to, maybe it's not so much that I need to know more about it, but I would like to make sure that it's not lost, is the role of discrimination may or may not play as part of the drivers that have been identified, discrimination in education, and how when a person of color does get their education, they still don't earn enough money. There's still discrimination in the job market. How discrimination plays into home ownership. The job market, again, in terms of income. Obviously, in inheritance, maybe that's not so much a factor. Other things that we touched on, let's see here. There was a question about, and maybe Tom, you can just answer this, how important were non-home assets in the model, in the research that you did, kind of where in the hierarchy do things like stocks and bonds and, IRAs and those kind of things, where does that figure into the contribution to the racial wealth gap? If you have a short answer that you know off the top.
Just quickly, relatively small because home ownership is by far the largest part of a typical American's portfolio, and it's even a larger part of the portfolio of African Americans and Hispanics. So
right.
What's there is the stocks, bonds, IRA stuff is relatively small, so it doesn't figure that greatly.
Okay, and I think part of that question too, maybe during Algernon had said, what's in the other 60%? If housing accounts for 40%, and maybe this is just where my mind is right now, but I think maybe that X factor, not to harp on how discrimination works into these systems, but I wonder about the degree to which, if we could put a percentage on it. Okay, in the interest of, I don't know if we quite made it to number 3. So on number 2, Brian made the point that somebody else had said, wealth is the source of the wealth gap. So I like that, and I'll throw that out there. The importance of focusing on kind of the history of the strength of public investments in creating, the middle class, the wealth and the assets that people historically had, during the 50s and 60s. The involvement of unions and a labor movement in kind of creating that. So I think maybe there's a question of, is that a story that will be effective and productive in moving this work forward? And there was the question of, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Kathy had said, thinking about every good story has got an end point, and thinking about, well, what's the end point of the story we want to tell? And maybe once we know that, how do you work backwards when you're thinking about what that narrative should be? Um, and I'm sorry, I forgot your name also. Almaz? Almaz had suggested also remembering to focus on strengths and dignity and the inherent value in our people and our communities when telling those stories and telling those narratives. I think I will leave it there. We sort of made it to number 3, but not quite. So thank you.
I just want to say that we're using our camera to record these remarks, so we want to actually take this back. So that's how we're capturing what you're saying. So we're going to move, we'll zigzag. So we'll go over here and then go back over there. I'm going to ask you to think about summarizing in about a minute and a half.
Sorry.
They didn't make it easy. Okay. When we talked about what do we still want to know about the drivers of the wealth gap, a couple of things were added to the conversation, or we feel should be added to the conversation, and that includes issues around land loss, and we thought that fell between home ownership and inheritance, and also addressing entrepreneurship as a part of the conversation. What do we think about the narratives or the stories that we need to tell to move it forward? We talked about, depending on the audience, the story that that we need to tell, and what that should look like depending on who was a part of that audience. We talked about making sure that one, it was a positive, aspirational story, as well as a way to get to the not the transponders, what do we call them? The people, the villains, yeah, the villains. And Avatar's on the way, okay. We talked about also how polarization or defeating polarization by adding more to the story, simplifying the message, and using a comparative approach, sort of like what happened during the campaign with Romney, and having a side-by-side story, as well as using different faces to tell the story, so that it isn't just a story when we talk about low income, that it's an African-American female mother, but it's different stories, and some that include individuals that are trying to send their children to college, or those types of messages that might come from veterans or other people or other players that are now falling into this category. And then some of the opportunities to exist to move it forward. We did talk about addressing some of the structural barriers by using a different narrative, and unless someone else has something to contribute, I think that was kind of where we thought the opportunities might exist to move the work forward.
Okay, our group consisted of Devin, myself, Mary, Sam, who's not here right now, and Al. On the first question, what do we still want to know about the drivers of the racial wealth gap? Okay, is this better? Okay, sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. On the first question, one of our initial answers was the perceptions and attitudes reinforce biases, and we need to change some of those attitudes. We tend to get fixated on structure, and we believe that it's a two-sided coin. So it's both the structures as well as the perceptions that we need to be addressing. Another point that was made is that interest convergence, we need to understand the role that can play and identify the various stakeholders who have similar interests that can work with us, and also identify the limits of interest convergence, because at some point, other players may not be as interested in pushing forward our particular interests. And we need to attack the perception by creating different stories. We need to avoid looking at issues in isolation. Very often we're looking through a stovepipe view, and we need to have a more holistic view of problems and issues that affect us. One of the things that, it may fall somewhere else, but we talked about modeling success and being advocates for people in our communities. Meet them where they are and provide them with the kind of assistance they need to work their way out. Be an advocate not just for the children, but for the parents. An example of that would be if a parent has an alcoholic problem, we get into a program. If a mother has a problem with anger management, we get her into a program. They need help in managing their money, help them learn how to budget and, use coupons and other things to be more effective. So sometimes we need to reach out and just be a little more hands-on. Structural forces often transcend and exacerbate gaps, and we need to be aware of that and realize that that's a part of the problem. And we need to follow the money, the role of money in constructing social policy. Very often we need to know where the money's coming from that sort of moved something forward and how that might be influencing what we're seeing. On the second question, what are the narratives that we need to tell to move the story, this work forward? We need to celebrate our strengths rather than fixating on our deficiencies. Our communities have all kinds of strengths that we rarely tell the story about, and it's not for others to tell, but for us to tell. We need to expose corporate welfare. Whenever the word welfare is used, you normally see the face of a black woman with children, when in reality, corporate welfare is far larger, but we rarely talk about it. We need positive stories about social policies so that we can see what the state has done well, so that we can celebrate that and avoid the corrosion of trust between people and government. And one of the things that we talked about also, this particular convening, there's a lot of value in the meeting with people that we've met here who are doing similar kinds of work. Now we need to find ways to work together so that we can be all that more effective. And we'd also urge folks to start at a local level, the school board, city planning. We need to get involved at those levels in our communities to start making a difference. And the last point is that it's great to be here with all the academicians and grassroots folks who are involved in programs, who are doing things at the local level, but we need to have an action plan where we can, when we have something that's successful, we can replicate it elsewhere. When we have ideas that are broader and deeper, we can begin to put together plans that roll this up into something that we move forward, be it a policy or some type of legislative agenda. We can draft something and make sure that the right people hear it and push it forward. So one of the things that came out of our group is, how do we take the ideas, the thoughts, the research, and move it to action? Thanks.
Oh, so after that very thoughtful presentation, that was really beautiful. Let me just start off by outing my team, because our articulation is nowhere near as down as that. So I'm going to start by outing my team. So we have a professional facilitator in Karen Burrell, right? I'm doing the narrative, but Karen Burrell is the professional. And I hinted that this was her job at the beginning, where I gave her props for being professional. It didn't do me any good at all. And Barbara took all the notes. Right, did I say that? Did the film get that? Barbara took all the notes, right? So there you have it. Now they're all out, the doors are open on that closet. So thank you. So I just want to say very quickly, we had an interesting conversation because we kind of actually got hung up on the first discussion, which was higher education. And we concluded in order to have a higher education, you have to have the low end of the education has to work first. And so we had a lot of conversations about why is it that even before we get to higher education, it's really a useless conversation if kids are graduating from high school and still can't read, can't do any kind of sophisticated mathematics, or for that matter, aren't leaving school at all. And we actually dove down into and started a conversation around why is it that the education system fails so much. We really only focused on a whole host of dimensions of education, which led to, naturally, to the next question, which is what narratives do we need to tell the story? And we sort of wrestled and struggled and went back and forth that we don't have a narrative that basically talks about how this country is failing in a way that gets individuals who are not part of us to understand it really is failing you as well. And understanding, you know, sort of a little bit of conversation around John Powell's work, you know, like how do we bring those people who are more associated with the super wealthy because of issues of race, for example, to relate more with us? Is there a way we can create this sort of counter fear, threat, whatever, that would make them feel, oh no, we're actually bound more to you? So if we look at, for example, the education and economic prowess of countries like China or India, can that be used as a lever to bring them closer to us? We didn't have any conclusions around it, but we said what we know is we need a better story that brings them over to us. And the third piece was what opportunities exist, and we just jumped into that. One of the things we talked about is how communication and messaging and technology and sophistication in that whole arena is so important now. And so that the good news is now we can do much more, we can reach much more audiences than ever before with great simplicity and ease, except it's not great simplicity and ease because we know from Rashid, from Alan Jenkins and others, it takes real sophistication. You have to be really smart. You have to have all the technologies. You have to have, you know, you really have to know what you're doing. And so we said, well, one of the things that might work is if there were a nonprofit. And rather than teaching and telling us and just giving us ideas of how to do better, that's always good to know how to do it yourself. But what if there were a nonprofit that was funded at a level that was significant enough such that they worked as a consultant to advocacy organizations? And that when we have major campaigns that we're working on, we can actually go to them and they will go through the whole conversation that similar to Rashid. What do you need to know? What do you need to say? How do you prepare your releases? How do you build your support groups? Who can you rely on? What's your target? They actually do that work for you as a professional consulting agency and help you launch your campaign. And that way you end up with a Rashid who's doing his thing, you know, in terms of their priorities, actually doing maybe 12 a year or 20 a year, or depending on how well they're funded, could be doing hundreds of beautiful, powerful campaigns working from education to housing to Social Security to education, health policy, etc. So that was pretty much it, and I leave it up to any of my colleagues to add more if they feel I haven't done so.
Hello, this row and this row was my wonderful group. For the first question, what do you need to know about drivers of racial wealth gap? We talked a little bit about the inequalities that have led to each of the drivers, and so even though we had some information about it, we thought maybe a richer database to begin to document for home ownership, both federal policies over time as well as recent speculation in higher education. We end up talking a lot about this too, about debt, and I'll say a little bit more about it in a second, but how it's financed and how the costs have escalated over time. And also more information on in vivo transfers from living relatives. And apparently there's some information from the MacArthur group that does a study on transition to adulthood about vulnerable youth that we might be able to tap into, but maybe build upon that. And Demos has done a study that I think Tamara's gonna send to all of us through the Insight team about their study on the great cost shift and how the cost of college education has gone up over time and why. We also talked a little bit about for-profit schools and how we need to know more about that, and that maybe they do a good job on 2-year degrees, but maybe not so much on 4-year degrees and higher graduate degrees, but just documenting that more. And we talked a little bit also about how K through 12 education has been underfunded, but the one piece we kind of went to is maybe having more money going to high school counselors, guidance counselors. And there's a group called the Young Invincibles that actually has made that part of their policy agenda, so can we support them in that effort? Going on to narratives and stories. Dalton Conley, in his book The Pecking Order, has talked a little bit about how people say they worked hard, but when you go deeper and ask them questions, they got a lot of transfers and resources. And so just finding more and more ways to refute the assumption that it's isolated efforts and individual efforts that lead to greater wealth. And the way we kind of put it, this is Sandy Darity's piece, but I think it's important. Wealth is not merit-based, never, hardly ever merit-based, and so making sure we kind of make that point over and over again. And even though it's going against the American ethos and the story's been told for hundreds and hundreds of years, we can keep kind of repeating that wealth is not merit-based. That might be helpful. And then call people out when they keep repeating that narrative, maybe very high-profile people like Mitt Romney, but anytime someone kind of makes an individual story narrative kind of hit back about the policies that are necessary to maintain the status quo. And we also said we need more stories about Wall Street cheaters and people who actually didn't use honest, hard work to get where they were, and make those stories more and more apparent. And one example, I guess, is in New York when Rudy Giuliani had all these Wall Street cons do perp walks constantly, and that doesn't happen as much as it had maybe a decade ago or so. We also need more land loss stories, both for black landowners who've had land for generations and lost it recently, but also how the corporate interests have come in and kind of moved out some of the small farmers. And then we weren't quite shy to do this, but some way to talk about this idea that was brought up yesterday about how Hispanics come with this illusion of opportunity and how it declines over time. So maybe how to document that, how to talk about that, how to build a stronger constituency around that story. We didn't talk as much as we wanted to about number 3, the opportunities to exist to move forward in the work, but the one idea we did have was to try to resuscitate the Occupy Wall Street movement, but make it even better and broader, and not just talk about 1%, but maybe 10 to 15%, and really find ways to either resuscitate it or recreate it in our own way, because that seemed to work in some ways, but it seems to die down, and how can we make it stronger and better again? That's it.
Thank you.
Talk about strange bedfellows, Rudy Giuliani. No. What is the name of the book that your organization did, Brian, about I guess, the narratives of, oh, you have it right there. Okay, you want to say it? The self-made myth, which I think ties in very well with the narrative of how people actually accumulated wealth not through pulling themselves up by the bootstrap, but through various mechanisms that helped them along the way. All right, so my group consisted of Carol, Victor, Araceli, Melanie, and myself. We talked a lot about education for the first question. We talked about education, what did we say? We said how it's linked to wealth in the sense of, especially given the current foreclosure crisis, we finance K through 12 education largely through property tax. So we know that certain groups, because of their wealth positioning, had lower resources than other groups, but now with the foreclosure crisis, it might get even more peculiar. We talked about education in higher ed as well. We discussed seems like the current administration's plan, which is not more resources into education, but to rather try to get at efficiencies through cost containment. So we talked about, well, is that a concern is education a market type good where we should use cost containment strategies like auditing higher education and having them demonstrate their product and how they allocate their resources? Is that the best strategy towards addressing education access, as opposed to thinking about ways in which we finance? We know that state budgets are becoming more austere, so money's moving away from higher education. And again, it doesn't seem like the current administration is seeking new funding streams, but rather audits of higher education in a similar way that audit strategy has been applied to K through 12 with things like No Child Left Behind, where now, there's this initiative for us to demonstrate, institutions to demonstrate the value of their product, either through student testing or other mechanisms. We also mentioned that education is an important asset, perhaps for consumption purposes, but we put far too much stake in it as an investment good to generate financial wealth or financial assets. That other things like having access to capital either through financing from banking industries or a down payment. Having capital, financial capital, and relationship capital is important for building. Relationship capital, meaning your networks, the networks that you're in, are important to generate financial assets. So again, I just want to make that point. We might overstate education in its importance as an investment good to generate financial wealth, but it is an important asset for consumption purposes in and of itself. What else? We got narratives. So for narratives, we talked about defining wealth less in terms of, when talking about what we're trying to do, not talk about it so much in terms of redistribution, but using American narratives like providing opportunity, that we want everybody to have access to opportunity, and wealth gives us that. Wealth gives us choices. We talked about words like freedom. Freedom's a big word. The freedom to choose, and the ability to just have freedom in general. If you want that, then you need assets and wealth. So we talked about the discourse in that way. And then finally, number 3, the ways in which what opportunities exist to move us forward. We mentioned things like, given the demographic change, perhaps we could talk about demographic changes that are inevitable in the U.S., as well as linking it to some other demographic changes that are more mainstream, like the silver tsunami that's about to happen. So we have an aging population, and maybe we could think of ways that we can tie in that aging population to some of the demographic changes that are occurring with the younger population. But again, that might not be our focus. That might be something we take advantage of. But what else did we talk about? We talked about also thinking about what opportunities exist to move forward, thinking about immediate strategies, midterm strategies, and long-term strategies. Immediate, okay, we have the president was reelected. Are there any current bills that we can think about trying to get through with the current Congress? Medium term might be, well, 2 years from now, can we think about how we might want to effectively change the Congress to get across new bills? And then long-term strategies, which we should start working on now. What do we really want to do that might have a substantial impact to substantively change how groups are able to acquire financial security? I think that's it.
Thank you very much. Let's give ourselves a round of applause.